Hi, let me tell you a little anecdote on why I call free jazz freaky. I knew this guy quite a while ago. We both connected because we were both writers and had a love of jazz. However, I had a sneaking suspicion that his love of the genre was quite surface level, and I say that in the most non-gatekeepery way possible. Also, I was 19 when this story happened. This was because, the first time we talked jazz, he had this air of superiority over the fact he listens to the genre, which in all honesty, I personally don't think it makes you automatically cool or unique, but it seems he thought it did. If you were to make that such a core part of your personality, you'd at least think his jazz game was pretty cool. He wanted to show me his favorite record, prefacing it by saying, "This album is pretty obscure, I'm not sure you'd know it." He went on to play Charles Mingus's He went on to talk about his other favorites, which included John Coltrane's Blue Train, Miles Davis's Workin', Art Blakey's Moanin', Bill Evans's Portrait in Jazz, all great albums, but it's like saying you love hip-hop, making it a core personality trait, and exclusively listening to 90s era boom bap. No shame in doing so, though. Now, me being the little snob, well, dick that I am, I decided to test him to see if he'd enjoy my favorite jazz record, Machine Gun by Peter Brotzman. Once again, I was 19. I played the album on the speakers, and as Brotzman's octet mimicked the sounds of a Heckler and Koch MG4, he said, "This is the freakiest thing I've ever heard." At the time, I laughed at his description, but I also thought it was quite apt. Free jazz is probably the freakiest genre of all time, with its complete improvisation and heavy handing of atonality, and then he said another line which would stick with me for quite a while. "I think I hate this. Is it even music?" Now listen up here, you little bit. First and foremost, a quick history lesson. Jazz at its core is experimental in nature. At its start, African Americans would fuse Western sensibilities of music with the sounds of African rhythms and chants. I am skipping past a ton of history here, so bear with me. Improvisation was a massive part of it, but Western sensibilities and approaches to composition made it hard to call jazz truly improvisational, although some were experimenting with complete improvisation in the early 1940s. Violinist Stuff Smith and pianist Robert Crumb individually were tinkering with atonal and microtonal sounds through improvisation. However, it was always relegated to personal home recordings as an off-the-cuff experiment they were doing, never making it to studio sessions. Really though, the groundworks of free jazz as we know it started around the late 40s to early 50s. Letty Tristano, who was experimenting with these sounds around the time, rejected the rigidity and commercialized nature of jazz. Although Tristano led various bebop bands, he frequently experimented with atonality and complete improvisation, the hallmarks of the genre. But there was a problem. Even though the works his trio was doing was recorded in studios, it was so polarizing that record companies refused to release them, let alone pay royalties. And as Jeff Pressing wrote in his essay on free and avant-garde jazz, 2 tracks were intentionally erased by the recording engineer. And because of that, he has been forgotten for the most part, relegated to discussions of jazz nerd talk. Despite that, he was one of the most influential pianists of his time, boasting students such as Bill Evans and Charles Mingus, alongside influencing the likes of Miles Davis, Dave Brubeck, and Anthony Braxton. However, free jazz didn't evolve in a vacuum. In the early 50s, a new movement was burgeoning in the world of classical called indeterminacy. Spearheaded by John Cage and various New York-based composers, it saw them intentionally leave spaces in their compositions open for complete improvisation and self-interpretation to its performers. Cage pioneered the concept of a prepared piano which produced dissonant sounds, and many European composers were inspired by the Dadaist who frequently played with noise. The 50s was a pivotal time for jazz. Not only was it at its height and popularity, it saw many different schools of approaches and genres appear. Cool, modal, bebop, hard bop, whatever you think jazz sounds like, it was pioneered in this decade. However, to one man, Ornette Coleman, it was all too rigid and structured. Although improvisation was indeed an integral part to jazz, it was largely composed and stuck to traditional sensibilities to its sound. Flip through the Real Books compilation of lead sheets and jazz standards from the 50s, and you'd understand just what Coleman was going against. Later in 1959, a legendary year for the genre, Coleman released The Shape of Jazz to Come, a very provocative title and an equally true one at that, although it wasn't really free jazz just yet. Although it still followed bebop's lead solo lead, it didn't use chord structures. It also saw Coleman eschew pretty much everything else from the genre. There was no chordal instruments, piano or guitar. It placed a heavy emphasis on improvised segments and the creation of a new approach to improvisation and composition. As the 60s rolls around, it kicked off with the release of Change of the Century and This Is Our Music, precursors of what was to come. You can essentially think of them as sister albums to The Shape of Jazz to come. Then later, into 1961, bam! We have free jazz. Free jazz, or known by its full title, Free Jazz, a collective improvisation by the Ornette Coleman double quartet, is what kicked off the entire genre in earnest. If it wasn't obvious by the title, free jazz consisted of two quartets, each playing on separate left and right channels. If you need a primer for what free jazz is like, this is a good place to start. 37 minutes of continuous improvisation done in one take, which was a first for its time. The album is dissonant, atonal, and completely free. Unlike preceding records, free jazz took a massive departure from its structured compositions and set its performers truly free. Now, we get into the world of free jazz post the release of, well, free jazz. As the 60s bore new innovators like Coleman, the wider world slowly took notice and eventually blended into other styles of jazz and music genres in the 70s, which gets me to my next point. Free jazz, surprisingly, fuses very well with a lot of genres, especially when it comes to the experimental side of music. Be it taking its penchant for atonal and microtonal compositions, its approach to complete improvisation, or how cacophonous it is, free jazz has embedded its DNA with a lot of different genres from the 20th century. Spiritual jazz is a good example. Kicked off in 1965 with Coltrane's Is a Love Supreme, the genre sought to explore the themes of spirituality, transcendence, and freedom in their music. Its rise goes hand in hand with the civil rights movement in America as African Americans fought against segregation and discrimination. Practitioners fused the sounds of gospel, Asian, and African music with free jazz. Why free jazz? It's because the genre's approach allowed its musicians to be truly free and improvise, which signaled their desire for reform. As the era of punk reached its maturity in the late 70s, a small subculture of post-punkers in New York emerged in reaction to the genre's commercialization and softening. No Wave, a spoof on the wildly popular new wave, took heavy inspiration from free jazz, noise, funk, and disco. Since its origins comes from the movement's protest against punk's commodification, free jazz was a natural inspiration. In the late 60s, jazz fusion took hold of the world. Although a good portion of it didn't owe its roots to free jazz, mostly coming from the world of blues and rock, it was Miles Davis who took it a step further. His seminal album, Bitches Brew, was his fusion magnum opus, taking influence from the world of free and avant-garde jazz and the psychedelia of rock and funk. Perhaps free jazz's most important predecessor, well, most important to me, is free improvisation. Free jazz as a name is a little bit deceiving, as there is still a good amount of composing done. Coleman's free jazz, although done in one take, is generally split into two sections and both starts off with a composed introduction. Various seminal free jazz works are actually composed to some degree, but free improvisation took free jazz's approach literally, as it relies on the intuition of its musicians to guide the music. Stemming from a mixture of classical's indeterminacy and free jazz, free improvisation is less of a genre, but more of an approach to music. Because of that, you see various musicians from a wide range of genres utilize it, be it Bill Laswell's freaky mixture of free jazz, improv, funk, punk, and dub, to John Zorn's whacked out version of avant-garde rock with free jazz, and the art ensemble of Chicago's heady fusions of free jazz and literally every music style you can think of. Beyond the genres which took direct inspiration, so many other musicians have cited free jazz as a massive influence to their works. From Paul McCartney, Iggy Pop, Thurston Moore, and Michael Gira, they've all cited the likes of Taylor and Coleman as major inspirations. So, do you want an overview of just how wide free jazz's influence is on music and jazz at large? When I initially came up with the idea of this video, I planned for it to be one of those guide to videos, however I thought it was quite passé to do it. Not only did it feel incomplete as I was just dumping a bunch of albums without much input into my views on the genre, but it also was just overdone. Well, I still am dumping a bunch of albums on you, but I feel like I can't leave you all hanging without mentioning a few albums you should check out. And if anything, this list should give you a good idea of just how broad the sounds of jazz can be. I'll try to do this as fast as possible, but a full list will be in the description. Of course, it's best to start with Ornette Coleman's free jazz, however you should probably listen to The Shape of Jazz to Come and This Is Our Music as primers before you dive into it. Coltrane's Ascension is a fantastic start to how spiritual jazz found its roots from free jazz. So too did Albert Ayler's Spiritual Unity, which alongside Coltrane's early spiritual works kicked off the entire genre. Davis's Bitches Brew and On the Corner too showcases the pinnacle of free jazz's offshoot into jazz rock infusion. Cecil Taylor's Unit Structures is an incredible progenitor to the rich compositional complexities which free jazz brings. And now we get to the wacky shit. Peter Brötzmann's Machine Gun is obviously a favorite of mine, and it's a great example of early European approaches to free jazz and free improvisation. Brötzmann's octet was barely ever composed and was allowed free rein to intuitively improvise throughout their sets. Another record from the European school of free jazz improvisers is Evan Parker's The Topography of the Lungs, Jesus, featuring drummer Han Bennick and guitarist Derek Bailey. It's weird and wonderful. Speaking of Bennick and Bailey, they also created a self-titled album together that is an incredible listen. Anthony Braxton, meanwhile, is the total opposite of Brötzmann. His album, New York Fall 1974, is technically composed, but this is what his compositions look like. It's pretty wild, and so is the music all across the record. If I'm going to mention Peter Brötzmann, I have to mention Sonny Sharrock as well. His seminal album, Black Woman, is the perfect distillation of spiritual jazz's power. Eschewing any world music influence, we hear Sharrock totally take the elements of gospel and incorporate it with free jazz into a powerful record. Cadona 3 by Cadona, which consisted of trumpeter Don Cherry, percussionist Nana Vasconcelos, and sitarist Colin Walcott, is a perfect encapsulation of free jazz fusing with what we pejoratively call world music, aka music outside of the Western world. Together they created 3 albums, and I highly recommend listening to all 3. Masahiko Sato doesn't strictly work under the discipline of jazz, however it's quite clear many of his compositions and albums has taken heavy influence from it. His album Trinity is an awesome blend of free jazz and minimalism. It's a miracle the Next is as influential as they are, considering when they formed in 1987, free jazz and improvisational was not the flavor of experimental music which was most popular. Despite that, for the past 4 decades, they've shown their ability to mix the sounds of free jazz, electronic ambient, and minimalism. I think their 2002 live album, Athenaeum, Homebush, Key, and Rob showcases it the best, although I'd also recommend giving Silent Night and Next a listen. When Bill Orcutt was part of Harry Pussy in the 90s, he functioned in the shadows of the history of no wave and noise rock, but when he made his return in the late 2000s, he paved his own sound which combined blues, folk, punk rock, no wave, and free jazz with his cacophonous and chaotic guitar. And his best album to date is 2018's Brace Up with Chris Corsano. It's part noise rock, part punk, part free jazz, as if Lightning Bolt, Sonny Sharrock, and Peter Brötzmann decided to come together and create an album. Surprisingly, the Scandinavian jazz scene is where a lot of Europe's most interesting material is coming from right now, and one which has caught my ear is Fire Orchestra. Their debut album, Exit, has been a longtime favorite of mine, fusing the sounds of krautrock, post-rock, gospel, and free jazz into one album. Another Scandinavian favorite of mine is Monstrous Dust Breathing, which fuses punk, post-rock, and free jazz. Ahmed's Giant Beauty is probably one of, if not the best, free jazz album released in the past decade. Fronted by pianist Pat Thomas with other various Cafe Auto cohorts, the quartet's entire deal is that they play the compositions of Ahmed Abdul Malik and reimagines them in a modern sense, exploring Malik's early fusions of Middle Eastern folk and jazz and his explorations into avant-garde. Matana Roberts over the past decade and a half has electrified audiences with her Coin Coin series, which interrogates America's history of the mistreatment of African Americans. Set to the backdrop of free jazz fused with black country and folk songs, all 5 albums are confronting and unrelenting. Out of all the records mentioned, this series of albums is probably one of the most challenging listens. In all honesty, I can keep mentioning albums after albums, let alone all the incredible records outside the genre which has borrowed heavily from free jazz, but I'll stop here. To me, what makes free jazz so amazing is its freedom, and I think the massive list of albums which has taken inspiration from it illustrates it well. When Coleman released his seminal album, it must have been a liberating experience for those who listened to it for the first time in 1961. Whatever preconceptions and rules jazz and the wider world of music had in place was completely shattered. I'm guessing it would have been pretty similar to when I first listened to Brötzmann's Machine Gun for the first time. I was totally blown away. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, pulsating, unpredictable, and intense. It stripped all my preconceptions and felt like I was listening to something beyond music. The album truly opened my eyes to a weirder, wider world, which, as you can see, I'm utterly obsessed by. And I do believe it can do the same for you as well. I think the best part of free jazz and its ardent belief in improvisation is that it can claim its roots to the beginning of music. In his book Improvisation, the avant-garde guitarist Derek Bailey, who I've already mentioned, writes, "Historically, it predates any other music. Mankind's first musical performance couldn't have been anything other than free improvisation, and I think it is a reasonable speculation that at most times since then there will have been some music making most aptly described as free improvisation." And I think he makes a fair point. When we create music, we're basically winging it and improvising. The only difference between Mozart and many of John Cage's indeterminacy pieces is that Mozart freely improvised, found melodies and passages he liked, and transcribed them. Cage, meanwhile, gave musicians a rough outline and asked them to improvise freely on the spot. No need for compositions or transcriptions, just do what feels right in the moment. Except even Mozart allowed for spontaneous improvisation by inserting cadenzas in his piece. In fact, in Bailey's book, he discusses the history of improvisation not just in jazz, but music all across the world. Flamenco, raga, baroque, African folk, and rock. Genres quite literally worlds apart, yet can trace its roots to improvisation. In the book, Bailey interviewed flamenco guitarist Paco Peña, in which he says, "We have learned from our elders what they had learned from their elders, but we assimilate the music and treat it in our own way as they did before. Flamenco is not a museum piece, but a living, developing art form, and as such allows for the personal interpretation of the artist." To me, that can apply to music at large. Improvisation is the path of furthering music, and if we were to treat what has come before us as museum pieces which should remain untouched, we run the risk of creating an echo chamber. Now, it's not true jazz has become an echo chamber by any means, but when it comes to the jazz most people pay attention to, it certainly can feel like it. There's this reverence for the cool modal bebop and crooner era of jazz in the mainstream, which is amazing, but feels like what Peña described. It feels like jazz is slowly becoming this museum piece which will never change, when in reality, since its inception, it's an ever-evolving art form which is constantly building off of itself. And because of that, so much of jazz to many people's ears sounds like jazz stripped away of its edge and grit. When I talk jazz with my family, do you know who they think of? Michael Bublé and Kenny G. When I talk to friends, it's pretty much only music from the 50s. It's great that folks are still listening to jazz, but it feels like so many hasn't moved past the early 60s. The school of jazz from the 50s was amazing, but barely scratches the surface of its talisman's best works. Michael Bublé and Kenny G are technically gifted musicians, but their works lacks the grit and characteristic of jazz's best crooners and saxophonists. Hell, the idea of music becoming a museum piece isn't just relegated to Peña's flamenco and jazz at wide. Classical pianist Robert Levin said in the documentary On the Edge: Improvisation in Music,
"We have a terrible problem now in the 20th century, which is that these pieces have become museum pieces. They have become, through almost limitless repetition, so thoroughly known to everybody that as soon as you add even the most tasteful of embellishments, people are aware of the fact that what they're hearing is something else. This was certainly not true in Mozart's time. I think if the average concert goer just pauses for a moment and contemplates the fact that he or she has undoubtedly heard every work of Mozart, not only twice as many times, but arguably hundreds of times more than the composer himself, shows something about our attitudes to be moved and our attitudes to be flexible about these things. I think, frankly, that the risk of appalling a few people who hear a couple of extra notes is more than balanced by the rewards of assimilating a language and bringing it alive.
Free jazz, to me, is the culmination of music's attempts to break away from its rigid ideas of composition and cleanliness, and is why I believe it to be the most important genre to the 20th and 21st century. As Jeff Pressing says in his essay on free jazz, although free jazz as a movement was indicative of African Americans' fight for power, it clearly struck a chord with not just musicians, but art at large. The freedom which free jazz allows strikes a universal touchstone of a basic human desire, to be liberated. It's fluid and boundary pushing. It's the genre which encapsulates the freedom and boundlessness of human creativity in all its chaos and messiness. Clearly, I'm not the only one who sees free jazz in this light, as so many throughout music history till today sees it for what it is. Sure, you can say whatever you want about it. It's freaky, it's weird, it's unapproachable, but to me, it's the epitome of music's constant forward progress and unwillingness to stagnate. And the way it attempts to break free from all conventions is by going back to our basic instincts of music creating, by improvising freely. And that's why I believe free jazz is the most important music genre of all time. And that's that. Thank you everyone for watching. Out of everything I've ever written, this was one of the tougher ones. I love free jazz a lot, but considering I'm not exactly a music scholar, it's hard for me to get into the technical side of jazz. Especially since jazz in general is so well studied in the world of music, I felt an immense amount of imposter syndrome while writing this. So, I think for the most part, I focused on the influence which free jazz has had, although I really do wish I could go into more detail about it compositionally, but yeah, oh well, I'm not exactly, up to speed in that. But anyways, do like and subscribe, or don't, I can't force you, and if you want to keep up with whatever I'm doing, do follow me on Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, I'll see y'all around.